And our next speaker is Stian, Soiland Reyes.
I'll help you because it's Norwegian Mexican name. Nobody knows how to say it. Stian Soiland Reyes. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. I'm here also representing Eli Chadwick, who did most of this work recently. But we have a whole team in Manchester, which I've listed there, and even some people are missing there. So I do computer science, but we're in the East Science Lab, which has been there for about 20 years since I started. And the fun thing about that is that we don't have to do computer science. We work with all the actual sciences, like the people in this room. So if I just get my remote. So we had this idea some 12 years ago now, something called research object, because we were getting a bit annoyed by people still publishing PDFs with a little figure in the corner saying, here's my science. And then how do you get the data? How do you get that 1 terabyte image data that actually is the results that you're talking about? How do you get the computational processes that increasingly is needed for doing the analytics and for doing the actual science? So we have this idea of the research object to kind of bundle these things together and then describe how they are interconnected, because usually you have one thing that led to another. It could be original data, like we heard, that you have downloaded someone else's data set and then they refined it somehow. Now you have the FAIR principles, attribution, where do you put all those descriptions? So that's the idea of the research object, to kind of get this semi-transparent box like that you can open up and get everything in one go. So the way we've done this, and it started in 2019, is something called RO Create. So RO stands for then research object. The idea is to make an independent format for packaging the data with the metadata together, but independent of where you're going to put it, because maybe you don't know yet where it's going to go. It may or may not go into the imaging archive. For now, you just have it locally, but you want to write down the metadata before it's too late when you forget, right? But we want it to be somewhat developer friendly, so we know everyone now is using JSON, so XML is now dead, luckily. For the most, it still exists inside your file format. Don't look too closely. But we want to have it kind of using web-centric formats so that we can easily also transition to what is used there. And also we want it to be extendable. We want to embrace what is already existing. There could be many different ways of describing things. Could be many existing formats you want to combine as well. So to be somewhat adaptable and flexible at the same time. But in particular, I'm thinking about this from software, because when I started working on this, I was mainly coming from the reproducibility angle. I was thinking we have these computers, we run our software, yet we come back 6 months later and it doesn't run anymore. Why is that? The computer is meant to do the same thing again and again, right? And yes, partially it's because we're not using containers and so on, like we heard. But even when you do, even when you try to be best boy in class, like I tried for a while, it doesn't work, right? Because you need to capture also how did you get these things? How do you put them together? What was the environment and so on? So to have some standardized data packaging, we can provide the data and connect it to the research environment. And then means we can then share across different tools and with enough glue code, so you can then pick out the things you need, right? Well, so the idea is to the metadata travel with the data, so it's not like left behind somewhere. It's often you go to a repository and you say, oh, this is the data, and you download it, and you just get like, what, a CSV file or something, right? And then all those descriptions they had painfully written down in maybe a Word document, they're all lost, right? And so when you come 6 months later and you want to write it up, oh, where did it actually come from? You have to look for it again, right? So also bringing in the workflow aspect that we talked about here. If you have a workflow, that's what you use, perfect. Now the reproducibility is so much easier because you can then give someone else the workflow. Well, please give me that workflow, right? Don't hide it again on your laptop. You need to share that as well, right? So we're trying to gradually going into open research practices and what are the components we need in order to do that. But at the same time, and this is what I've been working on the last couple of years, is to say, how can we use these practices also for sensitive data where, for instance, you have got health records or you're working in a trusted research environment and you're definitely not allowed to share the data, right? In fact, you have whole processes to make sure that no such data ever leaves the premises. That doesn't mean that you can't at the same time describe how you use the data. So that description can still be released out. So this is what I'm trying to cover here. So when we made something called arrowcrate, it's basically a way of putting things together. Roughly speaking, any of your folders on your file system can be turned into an arrowcrate by just adding a magic file called arrowcrate metadata.json, as I said. And if that file is there, that's it, it's an arrowcrate. That whole folder and everything below it is an arrowcrate now, right? Of course, there are requirements for what you should have inside that file, but this is in a way to kind of upgrade any kind of file storage, because files are still strong, not on our mobile phones anymore, but at least on our computers. And that means you can start being independent of where you're going to put things. You can start describing things together. And first of all, we start describing those actual files. Maybe there are some files from an instrument, there's some files that came after analysis, some spectrograph and so on. Each of those can then be described separately. So you describe each of these files to the extent that is necessary, right? If you have 10,000 files, I'm not saying describe every one of those files, right? You can do groups of files as well. But then connecting instruments, right? We just saw the lovely microscopes and so on. Imagine how many settings you have in those instruments, right? The focus and so on, or however is the precision you have. All those are crucial information to have recorded as well, because if you do it again with different settings, you're going to get different images, right? Even with the same settings, of course, you will get different images. But recording which instrument you used is also as important. What if you found out later there was actually a problem with that one of your 3 instruments, right? Which one did I use that day? Well, did you write it down? You can put it in the arrowcrate, right? And it's particularly interesting when the instrument is a massive thing, like Jodrell Bank radio telescope, so you kind of given credit to publicly funded instruments as well. But I'm talking about JSON because we're trying, first of all, to target developers, because we want this to be captured more or less automatically in your platform and so on, but then to move out of that platform into the next step. And that's all well and good for developers who don't have any problems with JSON, but of course, normal human beings who just want to do their science and maybe do some cell stuff in the lab and so on, they don't want to see the JSON. So we do have a button you can run and generate a web browser rendering of the same metadata, which I'll show you later. But just to scare everyone, this is kind of what it looks like, right? So you have some JSON description. First of all, in the beginning, it says, I am an arrowcrate. Please, everyone, you feel free to make new file formats, but please, in the first lines or so of your file, say which file format you are, right? Because I've had enough of these files coming in with .dat, so there's always a data file. Okay, I have no idea what to do with that. So arrowcrate always self-declares that it is an arrowcrate and which version it is. But then we're building on something called JSON LD. So it's a linked data kind of upgrade to JSON. So it means you can run a processing on this and get individual statements out of this. And this helps us define which words we use, kind of the metadata schema. In our case, our base schema is called schema.org. And a few web developers in the room who know about schema.org? Not many. You basically have to use schema.org if you want to get good rankings on Google and so on, because that's where the metadata for the search engines are picked up. So we found that a very useful vocabulary because it includes all kind of descriptions of things in the world, like people, organization, and yes, it also has ice cream shops. And we don't usually do research in ice cream shops, but we do have products we use, for instance, the instruments I talked about. So all these kind of core types we use from that vocabulary. And inside arrowcrate is extensible, so you can add more and more description, right? It's not limited to which keys and values you use, except that they must be linked in this way there. So essentially, as I mentioned before, we have 2 kinds of things you describe. You have the data entities. It could be one of those files that are actually there on a disk, or it could be a slightly more abstract data that is some database or something that maybe is too large to actually include as a file. So it could be by reference, right? But anyway, this is the data that you want to give away as part of your research object. But then you need to describe it, and that's your contextual entity. Contextual entities are things that, in a sense, you can't download, right? Like me and you can't, for now, download people, right? You can't download an organization. You may be able to download a car, maybe, right? Anyone get that reference? But anyway, we need those to describe the data. And it does happen sometimes that there even is no data, right? That is only contextual, right? Because you're describing something that happened only in the physical world, right? Like I talked about health record, right? So obviously someone going to having a visit at the GP and so on, like I did this morning, that is no digital entity as such, but there will be descriptions connected to that, right? And so you can essentially build up a graph on this, and this is why we're using the link data as an underlying platform. But the way we do it is to kind of hide that complexity of the link data for most of the developers. So they're just thinking about what kind of JSON objects am I adding to my file. But because we're building on the standards, we are able to pull in lots of different software and build a whole ecosystem of tooling to help process this, like I mentioned, to make rendering and so on. There are repositories that can consume our queries and then lift up the metadata that they care about, like funding, for instance. Or there could be particular ways to put things together, like put many of these crates together in a graph database. You could do that. So there are some tools that can do these more analytical combinations. And of course, there are graphical editors, so you don't have to write any JSON at all. You just click and fill in the form fields and so on. And it's used quite a lot in many different fields. So I'm here talking to an audience that mainly coming from the more physical field, but this whole thing started out coming from the humanities because my friend Peter Sefton in Australia wanted to describe in the Eldaka pod language data commons of Australia, which is recording indigenous languages and so on that are, maybe there's just 100 people left in the world speaking. So quite important now to record, actually physically record what are they, how are they talking, what are these languages like, and translate and so on. So even for such a research, this becomes quite quickly complex digitally because you have many different artifacts that relate to each other. But as you see in here, if you have good enough eyes or a microscope with you, there are people doing chemistry, bioinformatics. I'm coming mainly from a life science background, and all kind of things using the same core technology of RQA, but they specialize it in different ways. So I'll do something a bit more closer because I'm from Manchester, just down the road. I had a talk with my colleague Oliver, who's on a different project, also working on using workflow technologies such as Galaxy. And Galaxy is a very nice workflow tool, which we have used for a while in life sciences because it allows you to put together all these tools you want to run. Typically, they are command line tools put into a container so that you can reproduce it. But then you can drag and drop and you can kind of connect them up like graphically like you see there. And it's very useful just because it's easy to do that, but also to communicate what you're doing. So in this case, it's a simulation of some fusion reactor plans and also actually how it would be running. So in this case, you see some simulation going on, but even some 3D models are popping out here. So there's all kind of outputs coming out of this workflow. Each of these boxes themselves are nested workflows that I'm not showing you today. Yeah. But there are many, many workflow systems. And if this video was working, you will see me scroll to the bottom. There's like 300 workflow systems that we have recognized. And so how do you choose the right workflow system? So I'm talking about Galaxy, but there are many, many more. Some are graphical, some are command line based. Some are very specific to a particular field. Some are very generic. So we know there are many different workflow systems. And I'm sure if you follow that link and you see, you know of one that you have developed in your lab, you can add it as well, right? And again, just so like the file formats, nothing wrong with that, but please help them to describe the workflows you have in a bit more open format. So for this, we have in Manchester made something called the Workflow Hub. So it's a registry of computational workflows. So you can share the workflow themselves as a reproducible method. And you can basically upload or point by reference to your workflow definition, which in essentially is then a program of programs because you will have put together all these different tools. And on a good day, you can then download it and run it on your own machine. Now, we're agnostic to what kind of workflow system you're using. But we have made a common description of these workflows in our crate, which I'll show you in a minute. But first, let's have a look at another workflow. This one I found very interesting because this is from a different workflow system called PyComps, which is a lot more like script-based workflow system, essentially Python with some magic annotation, meaning you run it on a supercomputer and you can then do 10,000 of each step rather than waiting on your little laptop. So in this case, they have work package file volcanoes. Now, I didn't see work package file volcanoes in the previous one. I want all projects to have that kind of work package, right? So this is essentially doing a simulation of the Etna outbreak of volcano, which was fun for me because I remember being stranded when the smoke came out and so on. But this workflow is again a simulation workflow and is uploaded to Workflow Hub like that. So if you download it, you will see a couple of scripts and things like that. And already you're starting to feel a bit anxious, but what do? I just have all these random files in there. Well, in this case, there is an RQuery metadata file in there, which means you can crank the button and generate the rendering to the HTML file, as you see there. And then you can get a description. All the metadata we had before of the workflow has now come along with you, right? So you downloaded the workflow and you get exactly the same descriptions, but much more. You have more description, right? Descriptions that maybe in Workflow Hub we don't care too much about, but the scientists did care about in this case. So in this case, you see is still the attribution of the authors and so on. We have a different kind of parts to it. So these are the data files reference. You may notice those are not in the zip file, and that's because volcano data also can get quite large. So all the data doesn't necessarily have to come with you into the crate. Now, when we render this, we can then click into each element of that graph, and we can look, for instance, at the Python script that I mentioned. And now you can see who wrote that Python script, because often you have different people doing different things. You could put that in here. In this case, crucially for us is to know which programming language is it. And here it says somewhere in the middle, COMS programming model. So now we know that it's not just a regular Python script. It's something we have to run through the COMS workflow system. And here we can also see a link to how it's been referenced down here. It says execution. So we can even bundle actual execution of this workflow inside. And now we have more statistics and so on from the execution, all these parameters that came out for how much did it use on the HPC and so on, and which data did it produce, right? And now you can then click into data in the middle there and go into which data came out of that run. And so now you can connect your generated data to the workflow, which has a workflow definition and so on. And then, of course, you will see any inputs if you had provided those as well. So you can kind of then glue things together. Now, this is a particular kind of crate that we call the workflow hour crate. So the workflow hour crate is a subclass of crates, if you want. If you, like me, and learned about UML in the 90s, it's kind of like that. So you have our crate, which can capture any kind of data, and it may or may not be some software in there. Workflow hour crate says, yes, there is a software and it's a workflow. Then you have another kind of crate called process run crate, which says, well, I run some software to produce some files, right? Put them together, and now you have the workflow run crate. So you can kind of combine different types of hour crate like that. And this is called profiles, which is a kind of duck typing. And indeed, in the one we looked at, they had this conforms to, and they're saying they're all of those types, which meaning you get all the ducks together, essentially. So you can mix and match these types of hour crate. Okay, won't go into this one, but there's a similar one for environment data. So they have their own profile, which says where did it happen. That means you can do a search on the geographical information. The way we specify this is text, although we are moving to an actual formalization, but it's explained by example. So you will go into, for instance, say, how do I describe funding? You will say, well, copy and paste this JSON code and modify it, right? So all these linked data aspects and so on are kind of hidden from you until you go deeper into the tooling. And this is developed by a big community, which I can't list all the people of it now. It's got some 200 names on it, including Josh Moore from the OMESR. So we do have in our steering committee links to the bioimaging community as well. So feel free to join us. We have drop-in sessions and things like that. Of course, if you're in Manchester, you just come down the road to talk to me as well. All right, that's it.
Any questions? Okay,
right?
okay, Martin. Sarah, Martin.
Just a quick question. How linked in is it to software? The software development with all the version controls and how it's used. I understand how, let's say, it links into, let's say, synchrotron to work out the device and images, but with software, it's quite an interesting problem.
Yeah, I could do a whole talk about capturing software. So you're talking about versioning of software, for instance. So this is very important when you talk about reproducibility, because that's something we have whole papers about workflow decay, for instance. And even things like using containers doesn't solve the problem, because you need to know which version of the container did you use, right? Because people, especially PhD students and researchers, tend to do breaking changes to software, right? Ideally, there's semantic versioning and so on, and then you're happy. But there's a tension, because perfect reproducibility, you have to have everything exactly the same machine and so on. But people usually want to be on the latest version of the software, right? So something we have in Workflow Hub is a link to software registries. So for instance, in bioinformatics, there's something called bio.tools, which is a registry of some 10,000 tools, I think, which through some horrible magic I won't describe, can be linked to from the workflow containers. It's not perfect at the moment, so we need at the currently some manual annotation, which is there in the Galaxy workflows, but not in the other workflows. But through that, you can then find who made the software, what is the versions of the software at the moment, and all these things. And crucially for us, what kind of software is it? We want to know the functions of the software, because what often is the problem as well is saying, what is the actual science happening? Because if you just say, I do tool B and then tool C and tool D, if you don't know what these tools do, you have no idea what the actual analysis is. You need this kind of high level description at the same time of the analysis.
Okay, so in interest of time, let's thank Stian again.